Hey everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Cognition Ignition with C-Class. So one of the reasons that I was really able to pick up on personality type and the cognitive functions so quickly was because I've always looked at the process of life and consciousness through the lens of functions and the interactions between individuals and what is taking place at a more fundamental level in those interactions. What I mean by a more fundamental level is at a cellular and even an atomic and subatomic level. Now, I think when we think about personality types and how they have played out over time, where they are right now, where we can see a lot of differences between personality types did not always exist. Similarly to how we can look at the physical world and see some of the structures that exist currently that probably did not exist in the early universe. So, what I wanted to do was share some of my understanding of the biological and chemical processes that happen in order to give you a better understanding of what took place to allow consciousness to form. So we'll be going into kind of, is this nature or is it nurture? If it is nature, why does it not play out repeatedly exactly the same way over and over again? And if it's nurture, then why do these changes also occur? It seems that you can't have an extreme on one side and an extreme on the other with the complexity that actually does exist currently. So I put together these slides for you guys. I will be going a little bit deeper. This is really kind of just basics of biology and chemistry. I won't be going too much into the actual interactions between different particles or different atoms too much. We're going to get into the definitions of what's actually going on and how that plays out right now for you as a conscious human being using the cognitive functions that you have in your function stack. So if we look at this slide, the first thing that we'll see is that before anything can become an atom, there are subatomic particles. These are particles that have a basic positive or no charge. These were just in the universe, in the early universe, they were not really interacting. And at some point, something happened that allowed these particles to begin moving. Now, when these particles began moving, some of them were drawn to other particles that were in their environment. Some of them were not drawn and actually resisted creating a bond with the other elements that were in their environment. And we can actually see this when we look at the periodic table. You have elements that have a high ability to bond based on the electrons, and you have gases, noble gases on the other end, that actually will not bond to any other element that exists in the periodic table because they have all of the electrons that they need to take form. And what happens is that when you find two elements that actually do interact well together, they have the electrons needed to interact with each other, they will form a bond. These are simple bonds. We see this with O2, which is oxygen. We see this with CO, which is carbon monoxide. And then they can even form more complex bonds, such as H2O, water, and a more complex bond, CO2, carbon dioxide. And these are all happening because of forces that they really have no control of. They started at the subatomic level and were just quarks, protons, neutrons that were interacting, deciding whether they could bond with the other one. If they bonded, then you had your proton in the center being circulated by the electrons on the outside. And because you now have a form of an atom, it can interact with other atoms or other particles, depending, and form a molecular bond. So when you think of bond, I want to think about relationships. in a sense. There are some people that you are going to be quickly drawn to, and some that you are going to be repulsed by, and you will actually be pushed away from them. And this is the exact same thing that at a atomic and subatomic level is happening. Um, Now, what really happens is you have these molecular forms and bonds, and you are starting to not only create O2 or CO. What's really happening is physical properties are beginning to take place, and consciousness is not really needed for these processes. These are rock formations forming, um, metals coming together, and within these are all of the elements that are found on the periodic table coming to form in their own little community in an environment that they can exist in with the other elements that they can create a bond in a ecosystem with, in a sense. So you end up with actually little organelles. What we end up with, um, things that can begin to store memory. Really, it's because they have now the chemical interactions occurring, and they are taking place within the forces of nature. They are and they are becoming solidified, a lot of them. So even if a metal doesn't have consciousness, a dent in a metal will change the weight of that metal. That metal will begin acting a different way in an orbit. And through more collision, it begins taking more form, and these are chemical memories that are formed. This is the same kind of thing that you see now in welding, or when we bend metal to a certain way, or when we harden metal. These are all chemical processes that allow that metal to retain a memory. And this is probably what the early universe was doing with no need for consciousness generally to do these processes. Um, but each particle and each element will react a specific way based on the environment it is in and the other elements that it will be interacting with. So now we see that we have metals, we have carbon-based forms, and we have more elemental forms. These are like liquids and gases, things that we actually can take notice of in our atmosphere. Now, because we have carbon-based elements, or now that we have carbon-based bonds, really, that means that carbon is an element that can bond to most other elements quite easily. And this is also a property of silicon, which is found in rocks. They are basically semiconductors. So these kind of things are where memory is able to take place. Carbon is really the essential for life, and metals are really the essential for any physical elements that occur. And because of carbon, we can understand that chromosomes could form. And because of this, the entire cell can form. Now, there are processes in between which get really nuanced. We would have to go into some of the real chemical reactions, but the thing to realize is that whether we have consciousness or not, there are particles interacting without us knowing. And eventually those particles come together through enough evolution, through different environments, through enough interaction. Some interactions could take a whole particle and break it apart, which actually creates new energy in a different form. And there, again, no consciousness, and early on there was no life. Eventually a carbon molecule found a molecule that, or even a carbon molecule could have entered an environment that had already had enough force for physical processes to take place. It pulled the carbon in, and some of those forces interacted with the carbon to create early life, which really is simply a transition of elements and their properties. And we ended up with the prokaryotic cell, which is often a single-celled organism that kind of clumps together with other cells that are similar to it. They have no membrane-bound nucleus, which means that they can't actually crystallize a memory, but through interaction, they can react to stimuli, and it's all based on the underlying particles and elements that cell had been made up of and the interactions that they had interacted with. There's a lot of competition going on here. Cells are eating each other. They are dividing and taking over one another. This was what the early universe was. They collide with each other. They'll repel from each other, and they will begin creating their small ecosystem of cellular life. Then another thing about this early cell, it really only had one strand of DNA. So there's no connection between two strands of DNA explaining the environment to the reality of that cell. And when we think of these, what we're thinking about is like things like algae growing and how they just duplicate and expand towards the chemical necessities. So they kind of try to grow towards water. Algae is always going to grow towards water. And it's just the smallest memory that the particles picked up that it needs to be hydrated. And that's pretty much into that single strand cell of DNA. So there was nothing really crazy going on in the prokaryotic cell. It's as simple as the process of gravity and what happens when something drops to the ground. So there was another transition, which we'll get into in this slide. So now the big transition was from prokaryotic to eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells make up our plant cells and our animal cells. I do believe that it was animal cells came after the plant cells, and but there still is a lot that animal cells have it within them that plant cells also have. Really quick, what's the difference between us and plants is really, I don't think that we can say plants have consciousness. They have life. They have everything that the prokaryotic cell has. They have everything that is needed to survive and adapt to their environment. And I still wouldn't say that they are conscious because they are only reacting to the stimuli of the outer world. Trees always grow up towards sunlight, and the roots of trees always go down towards water. They will actually go outwards towards water. Wherever water is, they're moving towards there. But once they get there, they actually can't change. Their roots stay where they are. And if the water happens to go away, they can only follow that. They can't really grow backwards at all. Or they can't change the direction that they are moving towards in any way, really. So they're, again, just reacting to stimuli, which really would only need some kind of electrical force, we could say, that allows for a pattern movement. And maybe it creates some kind of dopamine center at this point. We pretty much do know cells can find reward. So they create some kind of dopamine center saying, okay, that's what you wanted to do. Next time you have the ability to do that again. Also, it relies a lot on the weather. Plants rely a lot on the weather patterns. They're reacting to those weather patterns. And when it comes to evolution, the plants that react the best are the ones that are going to last the longest and be able to continue reproduction, which means every time that tree drops its buds, or really drops its seeds, it allows for that memory of everything that it did right to continue. Now, another thing I would consider, and this is where a lot of lore gets into, because there's like, in these transitions, you have to think like, what really could have happened? What could we replicate? And a lot of this gets where it gets a little bit hard. How did something go from a plant cell, which could really thrive, it could really take over its environment and survive in it without even having to move, to something that was able to move and begin interacting with its environment on its own choice without the pressures of the environment playing a role in it. Uh, so that was when the animal cell came about. And what you see in the animal cell is that our cells are completely different, even though they're eukaryotic and they make up multicellular organisms. They lack a cell wall. I think the cell wall is huge for consciousness. Now, what I think is that, well, what I know actually is that because there's no cell wall, we were able to form more tissue. We're plants actually, because they have a cell wall, those cell walls basically line up to each other to make the stem and all the other parts. And when the cells die, they push them to the outside, which is where the bark and everything comes from. Where having the cell wall actually allowed us to spend less energy forming the formation of us because the tissues would form. And also it allowed us to be more mobile because our having no cell wall allowed us to be more elastic, which actually allowed for the movement. But one thing I would wonder is, were there other organs already being created separate before they came together? In a sense, was the brain already its own organ growing next to trees in a sense? Or was there some kind of plant that formed such a strong bond to create a memory and react with its environment but had no movement? And like I said, this is where lore comes in. When you see like the one-eyed creatures or the giants that maybe don't talk, but then you have other beings that weren't giants but they could talk. Somehow all of these individual organisms had come together, and this was probably a long, slow process. It could have been that there was something that acted like a brain, um, and it was taken over by another organism. It could have eaten another organism that didn't die, because one thing to realize is that prokaryotes are in our stomach. They make up a lot, they interact a lot with our multicellular organs, and they play a big part in breaking down the foods we eat and the way that our immune system responds to things. Um, so it wouldn't be too far out there to say, okay, a single cell organism entered a multi-cell organism and began affecting the way that that organism was behaving, and maybe even was able to use the electrical memory that had been basically I think it's electromagnetic, but the memory that had been formed in this organism. Um, and the reason I think this is because when you really think of what a tree is, it's not the same organism that a human is. Not even the same organism that a dog is. It's more of an organ. It's more similar to maybe our stomach or our lungs, because it doesn't have as much tissue, and really all it does is move water up and down the tree trunk to the leaves. It has underlying processes that are similar to humans, where it respirates, it creates photosynthesis, which allows it to use the energy that glucose has. So it eats the same way we do in all the physical processes, but it doesn't need consciousness to do this. These are physical processes that are that are made up of the forces that are really fundamental to our environment. I would say that we have more consciousness than animals because we have the ability to understand the underlying functions. So somewhere right about here is where we can understand what the functions are. And they are the ways that animals and plants are interacting with each other that allow for the consciousness to take place. And another thing about the animal cell is that it has a central nucleus. I think that having the central nucleus was a big change in how we can interact with our environment. Even plants have a nucleus that's off to the side of the cell, which, just the understanding of that, you can understand that it's in a sense one-sided. It can only react to the things on that one side instead of what encompasses the entirety of that cell. Like I said, this isn't really explaining everything, but it's giving you an understanding of like the system's underlying consciousness. And what I'm really trying to get at is that consciousness is still evolving. Uh, Even in the history of humans, our skull bone has become thinner. The layer between our brain and the outer atmosphere, which I really relate to the cell wall disappearing from eukaryotic cells. It's that inside of us, we get such a better understanding of our environment that we don't need so many resources to interact with it. So we don't need such a thick skull bone to interact with the outer world, because we don't have to worry about getting hurt so much. Also, because our memory is actually building from previous interactions of other humans who we were procreated from, is forming, and it's creating a bigger memory that really needs room. So we don't need such a big skull bone over time. And what our consciousness is really becoming aware of the functions that we are using that are fundamental to our subatomical makeup. And though I think at one time we are going to have a full explanation, right now a lot of lore is used, and there's still a lot of misunderstanding on functions because of how fundamental it really is. And you have to think about how you can create a change in functions even though they are fundamental. And the thing that allows us to create those changes is the complexity of those functions interacting out now, where we are aware and becoming conscious of our own behavior, not just the behaviors of the interactions outside of us. And this is the last slide I'm going to share for today. More is coming, but I think, yeah, we can kind of stop after this. This is where we stand right now, and I think that this is really making up the subconscious processes that create a consciousness. I think consciousness is its own form, it is its own force, and it is only created because we have gotten so far down the line that it is the next step, and we see it with the evolution of computers. And what I think it really is by itself is all of these different organ systems playing out within animals, interacting and moving throughout the world. It's not just that these need to exist, because I think these can exist independently. It's the transition of them coming together, understanding each other, even though they're made of different cells, playing together. And because these come together, they actually have a place to store consciousness. They have a place to recognize things, recreate the electrical signals that they have already experienced, and determine from multiple points what the best action is, which comes down to a cognitive function that your organ systems decide to use. And that's what I have for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope it wasn't too confusing, and I hope I made any points clear. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments, and I will catch you on the next episode of Cognition Ignition with C-Class. Thanks.